Anton Chekhov, The Witch. Night was falling. Savely Geiking, the sexton, lay upon his massive bed in the church lodge. He was wide awake, though it was his lifelong habit to go to sleep at the same time as the chickens. From one end of his greasy, patchwork quilt peered his coarse red hair, from the other, his large, long unwashed feet. He was listening. His lodge was built right into the church wall, its solitary window looking out onto the open fields. In those fields, a literal war was raging. It was hard to tell who was hounding whom to death, or for whose ruin nature had stirred up such a chaotic mess, but judging by the unceasing, ominous roar, someone was having a very hard time of it. Some victorious power was chasing someone across the plain, storming through the forest and over the church roof, drumming its fists wickedly against the window, tearing and slashing, while something vanquished wailed and wept. Piteous sobbing could be heard now outside the window, now above the roof, now in the chimney. It wasn't a cry for help, but a sound of pure anguish, the realization that it was too late, that there was no salvation. The snowdrifts were filmed over with a thin crust of ice. Tears trembled upon them and upon the trees. Along the roads and paths, a dark slush of mud and melting snow had begun to spread. In short, a thaw had begun on earth, but the sky, peering through the dark night, did not see it, and with all its might showered the melting ground with flakes of fresh snow. And the wind wandered like a drunkard. It would not let the snow settle, but whirled it through the darkness at its own whim. Geiking listened to this music and scowled. The fact was, he knew, or at least suspected, the purpose of all this commotion outside and whose hand was behind it. "I know," he muttered, wagging a finger at someone under the quilt. "I know everything." By the window, on a stool, sat his wife, Raisa Nilovna. A tin lamp standing on another stool, as if timid and unsure of its own strength, shed a thin, flickering light over her broad shoulders, the handsome, appetizing curves of her body, and the thick braid that reached the floor. She was sewing sacks out of coarse burlap. Her hands moved swiftly, but the rest of her body, the expression in her eyes, her eyebrows, her full lips, her white neck, all were frozen, submerged in the monotonous, mechanical work, seemingly asleep. Only occasionally did she raise her head to rest her weary neck, glancing briefly at the window where the blizzard raged, before bending over the burlap once more. Neither desire, nor sadness, nor joy, nothing was expressed by her beautiful face with its upturned nose and dimpled cheeks. Just as a beautiful fountain expresses nothing when it is not playing. But then, she finished one sack, tossed it aside, and, stretching luxuriously, fixed her dull, motionless gaze on the window. Tears swam upon the panes, and short-lived snowflakes turned white against the glass. A snowflake would land, peer in at the woman, and melt away. "Go to bed," the sexton grumbled. She remained silent. But suddenly her eyelashes stirred, and a flash of attention lit up her eyes. Savely, who had been watching her expression from under the quilt, poked his head out. "What is it?" "Nothing. I think someone's coming," she answered softly. The sexton kicked and pushed the quilt aside, knelt on the bed, and stared blankly at his wife. The timid lamplight illuminated his hairy, pockmarked face and skimmed over his matted, bristly head. "Do you hear it?" his wife asked. Through the monotonous howl of the storm, he caught a sound so faint it was barely perceptible, a thin, ringing moan, like the hum of a mosquito when it wants to land on your cheek and is angry at being disturbed. "It's the mail coach," Savely grunted, sitting back on his heels. 3 versts from the church lay the post road. When the wind blew from the highway toward the church, the inhabitants of the lodge could hear the bells. "Lord, imagine having the urge to travel in weather like this," the woman sighed. "It's government business. Like it or not, you go." The moan hung in the air and died away. It's past, Savely said, lying back down. But before he could cover himself with the quilt, the distinct sound of a bell reached his ears. The sexton looked anxiously at his wife, jumped out of bed, and, waddling from side to side, paced along the stove. The bell rang for a moment and died again, as if it had snapped. I can't hear it now, the sexton muttered, stopping and squinting at his wife. But at that very moment, the wind struck the window and brought a thin, ringing moan. Savely turned pale, cleared his throat, and began padding across the floor again with his bare feet. The post is caught in the circle, he wheezed, glancing spitefully at his wife. Do you hear? The post is being driven in circles. I know. As if I don't understand, he muttered. I know everything, damn you. What do you know? She asked softly, her eyes fixed on the window. I know that this is all you're doing, you she-devil. Your work, blast you. This blizzard, the post being driven in circles. You did all this. You're raving, you fool, she remarked calmly. I've been watching you for a long time. From the very first day we were married, I noticed you had bitch's blood in you. Raisa said in surprise, shrugging and crossing herself. Cross yourself, you idiot. A witch is a witch, Savely continued in a hollow, whimpering voice, hurriedly blowing his nose on the hem of his shirt. Even if you are my wife, even if you're of the clergy, I'd say the same to a priest in confession, exactly what you are. Lord, protect and have mercy. Last year, on the feast of Daniel the prophet and the 3 holy children, there was a blizzard, and what happened? A master mechanic stopped by to warm up. Then on the day of Alexei, man of God, the ice broke on the river, and it brought the district police officer. He spent the whole night yapping with you, damn him, and when he went out the next morning and I looked at him, he had circles under his eyes and his cheeks were all hollowed out. Hey! During the fast of the Savior, there were 2 thunderstorms, and both times a hunter came to stay the night. I saw it all, damn him. All of it. Oh, look at you, turning red as a lobster. Aha! You didn't see anything. Oh, didn't I? And this winter, before Christmas, on the feast of the 10 martyrs of Crete, when the blizzard stood for a day and a night, remember? The marshal's clerk lost his way and ended up here, the dog. And what did you go for? A clerk? Bah! Was it worth stirring up God's weather for him? A little devil, a snot nose, barely visible from the ground, his face all covered in pimples and his neck crooked. If he'd been handsome, it would be one thing, but a regular Satan. The sexton caught his breath, wiped his lips, and listened. The bell was no longer audible, but the wind tore over the roof, and in the darkness outside the window, there was that jingling again. And now again. Savely continued. It's not for nothing the post is being driven in circles. Spit in my eye if the post isn't looking for you. Oh, the devil knows his business. He's a fine helper. He'll whirl them around, and lead them straight here. I know. I see. You can't hide it, you devil's chatterbox, you idol's lust. As soon as the blizzard started, I understood your thoughts. What a fool, the woman smirked. So, in your stupid mind, I'm the one who makes the bad weather? Smirk all you like. Whether it's you or not, I only know this. As soon as your blood starts to stir, the weather turns foul, and as soon as the weather is foul, it brings some madman or other straight here. It happens every single time. So, it must be you. For greater emphasis, the sexton pressed a finger to his forehead, closed his left eye, and declared in a sing-song voice, Oh, madness! Oh, Judas-like wickedness! If you were truly a human being and not a witch, you would stop to think, What if those weren't a mechanic, a hunter, or a clerk, but demons in their likeness? Hey, you should think on that. Lord, you are a fool, Savely, the woman sighed, looking at her husband with pity. When Papa was alive and living here, all sorts of people came to him to be cured of the ague. People from the village, from the settlements, even from the Armenian farms. They came almost every day, and no one ever called them demons. But if someone stops by once a year in bad weather to warm up, it's a miracle to a fool like you, and your head starts filling with all sorts of nonsense. His wife's logic gave Savely pause. He spread his bare feet, bowed his head, and sank into thought. He wasn't entirely convinced of his own suspicions yet, and her sincere, indifferent tone had thoroughly confused him. Nevertheless, after thinking for a moment, he shook his head and spoke. It's never old men or cripples, it's always the young ones asking to stay the night. Why is that? And if they only wanted to get warm, but no, they're here to do the devil's work. No, woman, there isn't a creature on this earth more cunning than your breed. As for real brains, God help us, you have less than a starling. But as for devilish craftiness, may the Queen of Heaven save us. Listen, there's the post bell. The blizzard had only just begun, and I already knew your thoughts. You've been weaving your spells, you spider. Why won't you leave me alone, you cursed man? She snapped, finally losing her patience. Why are you pestering me like a coating of tar? I'm pestering you because if anything happens tonight, God forbid you listen to me. If anything happens, then tomorrow at first light I'm going to Dietkovo to see Father Nicodem and I'll explain everything. Just like this, I'll say, Father Nicodem, forgive me for being blunt, but she is a witch. Why? You want to know why? Here is why, like this and like that. And then woe to you, woman. You'll be punished not only at the last judgment, but here in this earthly life. It's not for nothing that prayers are written in the service books regarding your kind. Suddenly, there was a knock at the window so loud and so strange that Savely turned pale and sat down in terror. His wife jumped up, her face draining of color as well. For God's sake, let us in to warm up, a trembling, deep bass voice called out. Is anyone there? Have mercy. We've lost the road. Who are you? The woman asked, afraid to look at the window. The post, another voice replied. I knew you were conjuring, Savely cried, waving his hand. There it is. I was right. Well, you just watch yourself. The sexton hopped twice before the bed, collapsed onto the feather mattress, and, huffing angrily, turned his face to the wall. Soon, a draught of cold air hit his back. The door creaked, and a tall figure appeared on the threshold, plastered from head to foot with snow. Behind him flickered another, just as white. Should I bring the mailbags in too? The second man asked in a hoarse bass. We can't very well leave them out there. Having said this, the first man began to untie his hood. Not waiting for the knot to give, he tore it off his head along with his cap and flung them viciously toward the stove. Then, stripping off his coat, he threw it in the same direction and, without a word of greeting, began to stride back and forth across the lodge. He was a young, fair-haired postman in a worn-out uniform frock coat and filthy, reddish-brown boots. Having warmed himself by walking, he sat at the table, stretched his muddy feet toward the sacks, and propped his head on his fist. His pale face, splotched with red, still bore the traces of the pain and fear he had just endured. Contorted with anger, marked by recent physical and mental suffering, with melting snow on his eyebrows, mustache, and rounded beard, it was a handsome face. A dog's life, the postman grumbled, his eyes wandering over the walls as if he couldn't believe he was finally in the warm. We nearly perished. If it weren't for your light, I don't know what would have happened. And the plague take it, who knows when this will end? There's no end to this dog's life. Where have we ended up? He asked, lowering his voice and looking up at the woman. Gulyayev Hill, on General Kalinovsky's estate, she answered, stirring and turning red. Hear that, Stepan? The postman turned to the driver, who was stuck in the doorway with a large leather mailbag on his back. We've hit Gulyayev Hill. Aye, it's a long way. Uttering this in the form of a hoarse, ragged sigh, the driver went out and a moment later brought in another sack, a smaller one. He went out once more and this time returned with the postman's saber on its wide strap, a weapon shaped like the long, flat sword Judith is shown holding over Holofernes' bed in old folk prints. Having stacked the bags along the wall, he went into the entry room, sat down, and lit his pipe. Perhaps you'd like some tea after your journey, the woman asked. No time for tea drinking, the postman grunted, scowling. We must warm up quickly and be off, or we'll miss the mail train. We'll stay 10 minutes and then go. Only, be so kind as to show us the way. God has cursed us with this weather, the woman sighed. Yes, and who might you people be? Us. We belong here, with the church. We are of the clergy. There's my husband, lying there. Savely, get up, come and say hello. There used to be a full parish here, but it was abolished about 1.5 years ago. Of course, when the gentry lived here, there were people, and it was worth keeping the parish open. But now that the gentry are gone, well, judge for yourself, what is the clergy to live on? The nearest village is Markovka, and even that is 5 versts away. Now Savely is off the rolls and acts as a watchman. He's charged with looking after the church. And so, the postman learned that if Savely had only gone to the general's widow and begged her for a letter of recommendation to the bishop, he would have been given a good post, but he wouldn't go to the general's widow because he was lazy and afraid of people. Still, we are of the clergy, the woman added. And how do you make a living? Asked the postman. The church has hayfields and kitchen gardens. But we get very little from them. She sighed. Father Nicodim from Dyadkovo, greedy eyes, that one serves here for St. Nicholas Day in summer and winter, and takes almost everything for himself. There's no one to stand up for us. Liar. Savely wheezed. Father Nicodim is a holy soul, a light of the church, and if he takes anything, it's according to the statute. My, he's a cranky one, isn't he? The postman remarked with a smirk. And how long have you been married? It'll be 4 years this coming Forgiveness Sunday. My papa was the sexton here before, and when it came time for him to die, so that the post would stay with me, he went to the consistory and asked them to send an unmarried sexton as a groom for me. So, I married him. Aha. So you killed 2 flies with 1 swatter, the postman said, glancing at Savely's back. Got the job and got a wife. Savely gave an impatient kick and huddled closer to the wall. The postman stepped away from the table, stretched, and sat down on a mailbag. After a moment's thought, he patted the bags with his hands, moved his saber to another spot, and stretched out, letting one leg hang to the floor. A dog's life, he muttered, putting his hands behind his head and closing his eyes. I wouldn't wish such a life even on a wicked Tartar. Silence soon fell. Nothing could be heard but Savely's wheezing and the sleeping postman, who breathed slowly and rhythmically, letting out a thick, prolonged kh with every exhale. Occasionally, a little will seemed to creak in his throat, and his twitching foot rustled against the mailbag. Savely tossed and turned under the quilt and slowly looked around. His wife was sitting on the stool, her cheeks pressed into her palms, staring at the postman's face. Her gaze was motionless, like that of someone struck by wonder or fear. Well, what are you staring at? Savely whispered angrily. What's it to you? Lie down, she replied, never taking her eyes off the fair-haired head. Savely let out a sharp, angry breath and turned abruptly back to the wall. 3 minutes later, he was tossing restlessly again. He knelt on the bed and, propping himself up on the pillow, squinted at his wife. She hadn't moved, she was still looking at the guest. Her cheeks had turned pale, and her eyes burned with a strange fire. The sexton cleared his throat, crawled on his belly to the edge of the bed, and, approaching the postman, covered his face with a handkerchief. Why did you do that? She asked. So the light doesn't hit his eyes. Then why don't you just put the light out altogether? Savely looked at his wife with deep mistrust. He reached his lips toward the lamp, but suddenly caught himself and threw up his hands. Is that not devilish craftiness? He cried. Hey! Is there any creature more cunning than the female breed? Oh, you long-skirted Satan, she hissed, grimacing in annoyance. Just you wait. And, settling herself more comfortably, she went back to staring at the postman. It didn't matter that his face was covered. She wasn't so much interested in his face as in his whole appearance, the sheer novelty of this man. His chest was broad and powerful, his hands were fine and handsome, and his muscular, shapely legs were far more beautiful and manly than Saveless Two Stumps. Comparison was simply impossible. I may be a long-skirted unclean spirit, Savely said after standing for a moment, but there's no reason for them to be sleeping here. No. They are on government business, and will be the ones held responsible for keeping them. If you're carrying the mail, then carry it. No use sleeping. Hey, you! Savely shouted into the entry room. You, driver, whatever your name is. Do you want us to show you the way or not? Get up. No sleeping on the job with the mail. Warming to his task, Savely hopped over to the postman and tugged at his sleeve. Hey, Your Honor, if you're going, then go, and if you're not going, then it's not right. Sleeping won't do. The postman jumped up, sat for a moment, surveyed the lodge with a glazed look, and lay back down. But when are you leaving? Savely rattled on, tugging his sleeve again. That's what the post is for, to arrive in good time, do you hear? I'll guide you. The postman opened his eyes. Warmed and exhausted by that first sweet sleep, not yet fully awake, he saw, as if through a mist, the white neck and the unmoving, lustrous gaze of the woman. He closed his eyes and smiled, as if it were all a dream. How can anyone travel in such weather? He heard a soft woman's voice say. You should just sleep, and keep your health. And the mail? Savely cried in alarm. Who's going to carry the mail? You, perhaps. You. The postman opened his eyes again, looked at the shifting dimples on the woman's face, remembered where he was, and understood Savely. The thought that he had to go out into the cold darkness sent a shiver of goosebumps from his head down through his whole body, and he winced. Another 5 minutes sleep wouldn't hurt. He yawned. We're late anyway. And maybe we'll arrive just in time, a voice called from the entry room. Look, as luck would have it, the train itself might be late. The postman stood up and, with a long, luxurious stretch, began putting on his coat. Savely, seeing that his guests were finally preparing to leave, practically neighed with delight. Give us a hand, won't you? The driver shouted, lifting a mailbag from the floor. The sexton hopped to his side and helped him drag the mail out into the yard. The postman began fumbling with the knot on his hood. The woman peered into his eyes, as if searching for a way into his very soul. You really should have had some tea, she said. I wouldn't have minded, but he's ready to go, he agreed. We're late anyway. But you could stay, she whispered, lowering her eyes and touching his sleeve. The postman finally untied the knot and, hesitating, draped the hood over his arm. It felt warm standing so close to her. "What a neck you have." He touched her neck with 2 fingers. Seeing that she did not resist, he let his hand stroke her neck and shoulder. "My, what a... You should stay, have some tea. Where are you putting that? You treacle-faced church crawler," the driver's voice boomed from the yard. "Lay it across. Stay, listen to the wind howl." And suddenly, the postman, not yet fully awake, still wrapped in the lingering charm of a young man's heavy sleep, was seized by a desire for which mailbags, trains, and everything else in the world are forgotten. Terrified, as if wanting to flee or hide, he glanced at the door, grabbed her by the waist, and was already leaning over the lamp to blow out the light, when boots clattered in the entry room. The driver appeared on the threshold, and over his shoulder peered Savely. The postman quickly dropped his hands and stood still, as if lost in thought. "Everything's ready," said the driver. The postman stood for a moment, gave his head a sharp shake as if finally waking up, and followed the driver out. The woman was left alone. "Well, get in. Show us the road," she heard from outside. Lazily, one bell chimed, then another, and the ringing sounds, like a fine, long chain, drifted away from the lodge. As the sounds gradually faded, the woman bolted from her spot and began pacing nervously from corner to corner. At first she was deathly pale, then she flushed crimson. Her face was distorted with hatred, her breath trembled, and her eyes flashed with a wild, savage malice. Pacing her cage, she looked like a tigress being tormented with a red-hot iron. She stopped for a moment and surveyed her dwelling. Nearly half the room was taken up by the bed, stretching along the entire wall a heap of greasy feather mattresses, grey coarse pillows, the quilt, and various nameless rags. This bed was a shapeless, ugly mass, much like the one that always sat atop Savely's head whenever he took a fancy to greasing his hair. From the bed to the door leading to the cold entry room stretched the dark stove, covered in pots and hanging rags. Everything, not excluding the Savely who had just stepped out, was unimaginably filthy, greasy, and soot-stained. It was strange to see a woman's white neck and delicate, tender skin in such a setting. She ran to the bed, stretching out her hands as if to scatter, trample, and tear the whole mess to dust. But then, as if terrified by the touch of the filth, she recoiled and began her pacing again. When Savely returned 2 hours later, exhausted and caked in snow, she was already lying in bed, undressed. Her eyes were closed, but by the slight tremors running across her face, he guessed she was not asleep. On his way home, he had vowed to remain silent and not touch her until morning, but he couldn't resist a stinging remark. "All that conjuring for nothing. He's gone," he said, with a malicious smirk. She remained silent, though her chin trembled. Savely undressed slowly, climbed over his wife, and lay down against the wall. "And tomorrow, I'll explain to Father Nicodim what kind of wife you are," he muttered, curling himself into a ball. The woman turned to him quickly, her eyes flashing. "You've got your job, and that's enough for you," she said. "Go look for a wife in the forest." "What kind of wife am I to you? I hope you burst. You've hung yourself around my neck like a heavy log, you lazy lout, God forgive me. Now, sleep. I am so miserable," she sobbed. "If it weren't for you, I might have married a merchant or some nobleman. If it weren't for you, I'd have a husband I could love. Why didn't the snow bury you? Why didn't you freeze out there on the highway? You heard." She wept for a long time. Eventually, she gave a deep sigh and grew quiet. Outside the window, the blizzard still raged. In the stove, in the chimney, behind all the walls, something was weeping, and to Savely, it felt as if that weeping were inside him, and in his ears. This evening, he had finally confirmed his suspicions. That his wife, with the help of the unclean power, commanded the winds and the mail coaches of this, he no longer had any doubt. But, to his greater sorrow, this mystery, this supernatural, wild power lent the woman lying beside him a special, incomprehensible allure that he had never noticed before. Because he had, in his own foolish way and without realizing it, poeticized her, she seemed to grow whiter, smoother, and more untouchable. Which, he fumed. "Pah! You disgusting creature!" And yet, having waited until she grew quiet and her breathing became steady, he touched the back of her head with one finger, he held her thick braid in his hand. She did not hear. Then he grew bolder and stroked her neck. "Leave me alone," she screamed, and struck him so hard in the bridge of the nose with her elbow that he saw stars. The pain in his nose soon passed, but the torture continued.